Okay, so now I'm going to do a walkthrough of jamming. I've never actually done jamming from start to finish, so I think this will be a good experience to see my thought process while doing this. And so, apologies if I stumble a bit because I've actually never done this before. Okay, so step one looks like we're just setting up the React application the same way we did with Ravenous. So I'll open up my terminal and just run create React app. And it looks like they want us to call it jamming. Okay, did not realize that was a thing, so I'll just lowercase this. And I'll probably just forward this in the video so you guys don't have to watch this. Alright, so now that that's done, let's just head into the folder and open in Atom. And while that's opening, let me just see what we need to do. So we need to add these Google fonts and this fab icon. So let's download this. And okay, so these are the links to the Google fonts we need. So same way we did before, we just head into our index and just add some links. And the second one is this URL. So lastly, it's asking us to add a reset.css. It doesn't look like they gave you the link here, but it's easy enough to look up. You just look for CSS reset. Just go to the first link. Okay, so there's two things you can do. You can either just copy this text and then in here create a file called reset.css. And same way we're linking to the fab icon, you would do it the same way. You would use public URL and then use reset.css. But it'll just be easier to use the link they give you. So we'll just copy this link and add a new link tag to that link. And we'll be using reset.css this way. Okay, so it looks like step one should be done, as well as two. Let me close this out. Okay, so step three, we need to add a title to jamming. So let's do that. Let me just copy this and go into my index.html and just change the title to jamming. All right, step four is having us remove the stuff we're not using from the default create React app stuff. So let me just delete that. Oh, it looks like that we did need to use a reset.css file instead of just using the link. You could do that. It doesn't really matter if you do it this way or the way I did it, but I guess for following instructions, we'll just do this. Although this step should really be mentioned here when it's asking us to do the reset.css, so that would probably need to be fixed. So I'll just copy this and create a file called reset.css in public. Just copy the stuff in here. And then in our index.html, instead of linking to that, we can just use what we did here. And the file we want to link to is reset.css. Again, it doesn't matter if you did it the other way. I'm just going to follow the instructions as closely as possible. Let's pull this stuff out. All right, so step 5 is done. Okay, so step 6. All right, so I guess step 1 was just giving you a general idea of what you're going to do, and then they actually list out the exact things you need to do in the following steps. But we already did step 6, so we can just skip that, as well as step 7. Okay, so now it's giving us the component structure that we're going to use. And this was actually mentioned by a user in the Slack chat, so I'll definitely check that out to see like a visual diagram of the component structure, which is really nice. And they're giving you the HTML and CSS you can use for each of these. So let's go ahead and create the source components directory. And in this components, we're going to need an app. And I'm just going to move the app.js and app.css there. A search bar. Or should I just do this one by one? Yeah, I guess we're going to be doing one by one, so I won't do all of them right now. So we finished step 9. And we'll probably just need to keep going back to step 8 when we need the HTML and CSS for these components. Okay, so we need to fix the path in index.js now, because right now it's looking for app in the same folder as index, which is not the case anymore. So we need to go into components, then into app, and then select the app.js file from there. Okay, and it looks like we also need a background image for this folder, so let's just save this. And this is going to need to be in the app component, so we'll just put this in app. Okay, so now they're giving us the HTML that we need to use inside the app.js render method. So let's copy this. Oops, let me just fix this formatting. Okay. So that step should be done. Well, we need to change the class to class name, but let's do that now. All right, I'm gonna save that. So making good progress. All right, so 12, use the comments in the HTML document from the last step to determine the components you need to import into app. So we can use this to figure out what we need to import. So obviously we're going to need to import search bar, search results, and playlists. So I'm going to do that now. They don't currently exist, but this is just setting up the structure for it. So let's see if they actually ask us to do that right now. Okay, so it looks like we're going to be creating the folders for the components listed in step 8, so let's just do that now. So one is search bar, search results, playlist, track list, and track. Okay, so let's just import the stuff we're going to need. So we're currently in here, so we need to go out of app into components and then go into search bar. And then from here, select the search bar.js file, which is going to be inside here. So go back one folder, then go into search bar, the search bar folder, and then from inside there, select the search bar JS file. And we'll need to do the same thing for search results and playlist. So I'm just going to use Control D or Command D if you're on Mac to select all of these and just change the search results. And same thing for this. I'm going to change it to playlist. Okay, so once we've done that, step 12 should be done. Let's just create the JS and CSS files for each folder just to be safe. It might ask us to do that in later steps, but it doesn't hurt to just do that now. So playlist.js and playlist.css. Let me just close all these out. And this is probably going to be boring, but just bear with me. We're basically just creating a JS and CSS file for each folder, for each component. Okay, that wasn't so bad. Alright, so just making sure every folder has it. Okay, looks good. Alright, let me close all these out. Go back into app. Alright, so it gives us the CSS we need for app.css. Just gonna copy this. Just replace the stuff that was already in there with the CSS they give you. And make sure it's imported. We're not using logo.svg anymore, so we can remove that. That's just from the create React app stuff. Alright, step 13 looks good. So yeah, like I mentioned, they're probably going to ask us to do this one by one, but it doesn't really hurt just to do it all at once. So we did the search bar stuff. Now we can actually update searchbar.js to return this HTML. So let's go into search bar, close this stuff out. So for every React component, we just need to make sure to import React and import the CSS for that file. So search bar is going to obviously import searchbar.css. And then we just create a class that extends React to component. And then just export it. And the one method that every React component needs to have is render. Okay, so let's just go back to the code. Let me just make sure this is copied. And we need to return that HTML. Okay, so searchbar.js is done. Same thing, just change class to class name everywhere. And we need to look inside the HTML to see if we need to import any components based on like if there were comments in app, but there aren't any here, so we don't need to. And yep, just make sure you export it. So step 15 is good. And now they give us the CSS we need for this component. Let me copy that. Paste in here. Okay, cool. And we're importing this already, so that's good. All right, so now we're doing search results. Same thing, we already created the JS and CSS file. And they give us the HTML. We just copy this. Oh, sorry, this is search results. Same thing. Hopefully this is gotten to be kind of like a pattern that you're used to. So in this case, we have an HTML comment that says we're going to need track lists, so we're going to have to import that. So we're currently in this folder, so we need to go up one folder and into track lists, and then select the tracklist.js file from there. You can put, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but you can put .js if you want, but by default it already assumes they're using .js, so you can just omit that, which is why I usually do. And we should probably replace these comments with the actual code we're going to need here. I don't know if they're going to ask us to do that in a later step. Yeah, I'll just wait just to see if they ask us to do that. Otherwise, I'll do it later. Okay, so let's just make sure class is class name. Okay, good. Actually, I don't think I changed this myself. Did they already give it as class name? Oh, all right. All right, and then the CSS we need for it. Okay. Now we're doing the playlist. We already created the playlist folder and the JS and CSS file, so we can skip that step. All right, so the HTML and the CSS we need for it. Okay, so I'm just gonna copy this entire component just so we don't have to keep typing it out all the time. And we might not need the import, so I'll remove that. And then we'll just change search results everywhere to playlist. All right, so this is the HTML they give us. So let's just replace that. And we actually do need to import track list, so let's do that. And let me just move the CSS import to the bottom. Oh, I'm not actually giving these imports names, am I? Should probably be doing that. Whoops. So I just went back to search results to fix that and do it from here as well. The only time you don't need to do this import X from path is when you're importing a CSS, because obviously you don't need to use a variable name anywhere in your file, you just import the CSS. But for everything else, you need to make sure to give the name. Let me just make sure I didn't do that in app as well. Okay, good. Let me just move this CSS import to the bottom. All right, good. So that's the HTML for playlist. Let me just copy the CSS as well. Okay, good. Let me close all this out now. Let me just make sure I fix class to class name. Okay, so it's telling us that we can comment out track. Okay, so I guess we should actually be replacing these comments with the actual code we're going to be using. So let's just do that. So we're going to be rendering the track list here. Same thing for search results. Track list. And oh, we haven't gotten there yet. So search bar is good. App. Let's just fix this. Okay, cool. So that should be good. And it's telling us for playlist we can comment out track list right now because it won't currently work. So let's just do that. And to comment in Atom, if you want to comment out this current line you're on, you can just do Control/, the key that has the question mark on it, or you can just do Command/ if you're on Mac. And we already did the playlist CSS, right? So we're done with that. And we should probably do the same thing in search results. So I'll just comment this out. So now we need to do track list. We can skip 23. And now we need to copy this HTML and CSS. Let me just create a component for it first. So tracklist.js, let me just copy this, move the import, and just change playlist everywhere to tracklist. Okay, now let me copy the HTML they give us. And the CSS looks like it's just this. Make sure we import it. All right, this should be track list. Let me just make sure that my CSS imports use the correct name. Okay, search results looks good. Search bar, playlist, and app. Okay, cool. And let me fix class to class name. So we need to hard code 3 tracks. Do we actually do that within this step, or are they going to have us do that? Let's just check the hint to make sure. Okay, looks like it's not asking us to do that right now, so I'm just gonna skip that. So now we need to do track. Let me just copy this file. Oh, I missed one. Okay, so the HTML and the CSS. Oops, let me fix that formatting. And we are importing it, good. Okay, we need to fix class to class name. Okay, so it looks like this component needs an extra method called render action. And it's going to display a minus if it has an is removal prop. Otherwise, it's going to have a plus inside it if the is removal prop is false. And the class name is going to be track action. Okay, so it's basically this element right here. We just need to create a method that's going to render this. So let's create a method called render, what was it? Render action. And so it's going to check if it has an is removal prop. If it is, it's going to return a minus, otherwise it's going to return a plus. So we can check if it has a is removal prop, and the way you can check that is using this.props and checking if this.props has is removal. So we can do equals equals true, but just checking, because it's a Boolean value, we can just omit that. So if it's true, we're going to return this element. And it's going to be a minus. Otherwise, we're going to return a plus. And then in here, we're just going to call this dot render action. Set the class name to track action. So in either case, it should have that class. Okay, let's just make sure there's no comments saying we need to import any other things. Looks like there's not. And just export it. We are doing that, so we're good to step 27. And track CSS. We already did, so we're good on that. Okay, so now let's go to step 29. Okay, so we're going to pass the state of search results through a bunch of components to render an array of tracks. So when we actually do an HTTP request to Spotify, we're going to get an array of song tracks, and each track object will have a name, artist, and an album. Okay, so for each track in the results list, your Jammming app will display that stuff. Okay, so later we're going to be actually using the Spotify API to get this stuff. Alright, so that's just giving us some description. Okay, so we need to add a constructor to app. So let's do that. Let me close all this stuff out. Okay, so add a constructor. And it takes in props. And obviously we should be calling super with props. Let's just make sure that's what it's asking. Yep. Okay, so right now we're going to be setting a hard-coded value for search results. Obviously later that's going to be whatever the API returns. But I guess this is just to make sure everything is okay right now. So initialize this.state an object as always. And we need to add a search results. And I imagine this would be an array of tracks. Yep, so it's going to be an array of objects, and each object should have a name, an artist, an album, and an ID, as mentioned up here. So let's do that. So we're going to have a bunch of objects in this array. So the first object, let's just make up stuff. Name, artist. Let's go with Linkin Park. Oh, I guess this is the song name. Alright, let's just... Album. Actually, I have no idea what the album name is. And ID. I guess ID can be anything. It just be unique for each one. So that's the first track. And just to be faster, I'm just gonna put in random values. Okay, looks like that step should be good. Okay, so now we need to pass the search results from app to the search results component where it's going to be used. And to pass the state of one component to another component, you do it via props. And to pass a prop, we just choose what name we want to make the prop. We'll just call the prop search results. You can call this whatever you want, but let's just be consistent. So, and we need to pass it the search results that's currently in the state. And because we're passing a JavaScript value to the prop, we need to use curly braces. And we'll just do this.state.search results. So we're passing this search results array to search results, the search results component, and we're passing it a prop called search results. So in the search results component, we're going to have access to that array we passed it using this.props.search results. And if we call this something else like blah, we'd have access to the array via this.props.blah in here. Okay, so looks like that's done. And then from search results, looks like we need to pass it down further to track lists. And this is kind of common in React. If you have state in a very high level component, you need to keep passing it down until you get it to the place you want. So from here, we need to pass. So I guess now we can uncomment this because we're going to be passing it something now. So we're going to be passing it. Does it give us a name we have to call it? I guess we can just call it tracks. And the tracks are whatever we got passed, which is this.props.search results. Let's just make sure. Okay, yep, that looks good. So now in our track list right now, we're not rendering anything inside this div, but we're going to be basically looping over all the tracks that we receive and then rendering something based on each track. And to do that, we can use map. Now remember, map it basically applies a transform on an array. So it applies the same transform on each element in the array. So if we have an array like 1, 2, 3, and we apply a double function to each one, map will basically return 2, 4, 6. So it applies one transform to each element to get a new array. So in this case, we're basically going to be transforming each track into an HTML element. So let's remove this. So we're going to be mapping over each track. So let's do that. So because this is a JavaScript expression, we need to use curly braces. So we're going to be mapping over this.props.tracks. I did call it tracks, right? Yep. And we're going to do map. So for each track, we want to return some HTML element. Does it tell us what kind of element to use? Oh, we're going to be using the track component. So for each track object, we're going to be rendering a track component. And this track component would obviously need to know what track it's rendering, so we're going to have to pass it the track we're using. We'll just call the prop track and just pass it the current track we're on in the loop. Okay, so render the track name, artist, and album. So yeah, some people had questions on this in the Slack chat. It should probably be specified what it's talking about here, but it's referring to track.js. So where these comments are, we need to instead replace them with the track object that we receive as a prop. So instead of track name, we'll go here. We're going to use this.props.track.name. And because it's a JavaScript expression, we want to wrap in curly braces. One thing you can do in Atom, if you select a bunch of text and then do shift opening curly brace, the left curly brace. So shift curly brace, it'll wrap the selection in curly braces. So you don't have to like put it on the lines yourself. Okay, so track the artist will go here. And this.props.track. Oh, sorry, I forgot what that was. Album. Okay. Okay, so that should be good. Just make sure. Yep. Okay. Oh, we're not setting a key on the map. So one thing you should do when you do a map or any kind of array iteration in your JSX, if you're rendering multiple items at the same time, you need to give each one a key. That's just the React thing. It doesn't matter what you assign to the key, but each one should be different. And so what we can use for key here is track.id, because in our app.js, we gave each one of these a unique ID. So we can just use that. And the Spotify API, the response still have unique IDs, so it'll be fine. Okay. Now it looks like we're going to be passing down playlist to track list. Alright, so we're going to be adding some new parts to the state. So let's go back to app.js. And after search results, we're going to have a new thing called playlist tracks, which is also going to be an array. And each one of these is also going to be track objects, I believe. So Yep, same thing. So I'm just going to copy the ones we currently have. And I'll just change these to playlist track. And I'll just continue to give these unique IDs. So 4, 5, 6. Sorry for these awful names, but you probably don't want to sit around and wait for me to come up with actual songs. So, okay. Looks like these steps should be good. So we need to pass the playlist name and tracks from the app. Oh, sorry, we haven't set a playlist name in our state, so let's do that as well. And I imagine that's just gonna be a string. Does it give us what we should set it to initially? Any strings, so let's just call it my playlist. So we need to pass these parts of our state from app to the playlist component. So let's pass the name. And we also need to pass it the tracks. And I'm just going to run prettier to format the code. Okay. Alright, so we need to pass the tracks further down. So from playlist, we can uncomment this out now. And so for the tracks, for this one, we're just going to be passing this.props.playlist tracks. Okay, so 40, we need to add a new method to app.js called addTrack. So now we're going to be creating a method called addTrack, which is basically when you click one of these plus buttons, the song will be added to the playlist, as long as the song doesn't already exist in the playlist, because you don't want to add multiple of the same song in the same playlist. So we're going to be doing that now with a method called addTrack inside app. So let's do that. Add-track. Okay, so this add-track method is going to take a track as an argument. So let's do that. Track. And it's going to use the ID property of the track to make sure that it doesn't already exist in the playlist state. So there's a few ways we can check if an array already contains an object with the property that we're looking for. The easiest way is to use the find method. So let me give you an example. So if we have an array of numbers called nums, we can use nums.find, and you pass find a function that runs on each element in the array. So we'll just call the current, when it's on, current num. So if the current num, let's just say, equals 2. So basically you pass it something to check for. So in this case, we're checking if the current number is 2. So the find method will loop through each element in the array and check if one of the numbers is 2. If it is, it will return that element. So we can say let output equals 2. So output will become 2 basically. And in this case, what we want to do is check if the array of objects has a track with this ID. So what we can do is loop through, so we'll just say const tracks equals, it doesn't matter if you use const or let, I just like using const everywhere, equals this dot state dot playlist tracks. So we'll say const output equals nums or tracks dot find. So we're going to loop through each track in this array. So current track, and we need to check if the current track dot ID is equal to the ID of the track that we're checking for. So basically, if it does find a track with this ID, it will return that as output. Otherwise, it will return undefined. So what we need to check if output equals undefined. No, sorry, we need to check to make sure if it's not undefined, then we're going to add it to the track. Otherwise, we just don't do anything. And instead of checking if it's undefined like this, we can just remove this because this will return true if it is undefined. So if it's not undefined, then we need to add this track to the playlist tracks array. So what we can do is tracks.push the track, and then we'll update, because just updating this array manually doesn't do anything. State doesn't update unless you actually call the set state method. So we need to do this.set state, and we'll update the playlist track state, and we'll set it to the newly updated tracks. And if you want to read more about the array find method, I have it open here. You can just Google array find JavaScript and just go to the first link, and you can read more about how it works. So yeah, it'll return the first element that meets this condition, otherwise it'll just return undefined. Okay, so add track should be done. And because we're going to be passing this add track method somewhere else, we need to make sure to bind it. Because whenever you need to set a function, pass a function as an event handler, you're going to need to bind it. And we're going to be passing it to this plus click handler, so we're going to make sure that we bind it in our constructor. So we'll just do this.addTrack equals this.addTrack.bind this. Okay, cool. So step 42 looks good. All right, so now we're going to be passing on add. I guess they're talking about add track, but I don't know why they called it on add here. Oh, I guess that's the prop name they want to give it to track list. So from search results, oh, sorry. So before we get here, we should be passing add track to the search results component. And then we're going to be passing it from search results to track list. So let's do that. And they want us to call it add track. So let's do add track equals this dot, what's the method name? Add track. Okay, same thing. Okay, so we're passing it from app to search results. And then from search results, we need to pass it, I guess they want us to call it on add here. And we receive it as a prop called add track. And we pass an is removal with false. This way it'll render a plus instead of a minus, because we're checking for is removal inside the track list component, or sorry, inside track. Although, because we're doing the check in track for is removal, we need to make sure that we pass it from track list to the track. So I don't know if this is mentioned in the instructions. I actually think it might not be. I remember getting a question on that, so that needs to be fixed here. But because we're checking for it in track, we need to make sure that we pass the is removal prop that we receive in track list from here to track. So let's just pass down the is removal, and we'll just pass it whatever we get. Okay, and we need to make sure to pass the onAdd from track list component to the track component. So we'll pass it onAdd. And it's not always going to get an onAdd. If it's removal, then it'll get like onRemove, but if not, it'll get onAdd. But in this case, it'll just pass undefined for onAdd, so it doesn't really matter. And the order of the props that you pass doesn't matter at all either, just in case that's not clear. So let me just format my code with prettier. Okay, so 44 should be good. And I actually haven't been running this locally just to make sure everything's working, so I should probably be doing that. You definitely want to do this in the beginning. I've just been kind of trying to save time by not doing it, but I should do that right now. So I'll just npm start this application. And this is why you would want to do it early on, so to catch errors like this. So it looks like track is not defined in track list, so we might not be importing it. Yep. So we're rendering a track, but we don't import this track, so it doesn't know what we're talking about. So let me just import track from track. Let's see if there's any other errors. Okay, good. And right now we didn't attach the click listener, so it won't do anything, but at least we know that our application is running. And this is removal. We're not passing false yet, so which is why it's just rendering a plus. So let's just go back to our steps. Create an add track method in track component. Okay, so in our track, let's just create an add track method. I like putting all my render methods on the bottom, so I'll just move my add track up here. And we're going to be using it to add this.props.track to the playlist. So in track list, we're passing an onAdd prop to track. So we can access this function via this.props.onAdd here. So in here, we're just going to be using this.props.onAdd. And we're going to be passing it the this.props.track there, because each track component is going to be receiving a track object. So we're just going to be passing that to onAdd. Okay, so that should be good. Make sure no errors, good. So now we need to add a constructor to track. And we need to bind this.addTrack to okay. So in track.js, when we click on the plus, it should call this.addTrack. So that's only for the plus case, so we'd only want to add the onClick here. And we'd want to run this.addTrack. And because we're passing this function as a click listener, that's why we need to bind it. Okay, so now we're getting onto the remove section. Okay, so this is just giving a description of what we're going to be doing. So when we click on this minus, it should be removing the track from the playlist. So in app.js, we're going to be creating a remove track method, similar to how we create an add track method. So below this, I'll just add remove track. So obviously it's going to need a track as an argument to know which track to remove. And we're going to be using the ID to see which one we need to remove from the state, similar to how we did here. So in this case, there's actually a better function we can use, which is the array filter method. And the way filter works is, let me give an example. So let's say we have, and we want to remove all even numbers from this array. So what we can do is create a new array using the filter method. And so filter will loop through each number. We'll just call the current one is looping on current num. And so you pass it a function of which elements you want to keep. So we only want to keep the ones that are odd. And the way we can do that is just to make sure it's not divisible by 2. And so odds will basically, so you doing this, odds will only return 1 and 3. So odds will look like something like this. Oh, it should be not equal to 0. Because if modular 2 is equal to 0, that means it is divisible by 2. But if it's not, if it doesn't give us 0 when we use the mod operator, then that means it's odd. I'm getting way too much into this, but I'm basically just trying to explain how a filter works. So in this case, we want to filter out any track that has the ID of the one that we pass in. So we can get the current tracks by doing the same thing we did up here. And we'll just call it filter tracks equals tracks.filter. So we just want to keep the ones that don't have the same ID as this one. So we can just do is not equal to track.id. Sorry if these symbols are confusing. It's just something I have programmed in my editor, but this is this symbol is basically equal to this. But if I don't have a space here, it just formats it as this. But I'm basically just doing the not equal to. Sorry if that's confusing. And same thing up here. This is just equals equals equals. Okay, so we're filtering out any tracks that have the same ID as this, and we just need to update our state. So update our playlist tracks to the filter tracks. And same thing, if you want to look into how that works, you can just look up array filter JavaScript. Just go to the first link, and there's a pretty good explanation of how it works. The documentation still uses like the old JavaScript style, so you'll see var in a lot of places, but you can just ignore that. Okay, so remove track looks good. All right, so we need to bind the value of this because we're going to be passing it. So let's just bind it in app. Okay. And we're going to be passing remove track from app to playlist. Oh, whoops. And we're going to be calling it on remove, it looks like. Oh no, just remove track. So we'll just call it remove track. This dot remove track. Same thing like we did in search results with add. Okay. Oh, it's saying to call it on remove, yeah. And we're going to be passing on remove from playlist to track list. So same thing. We receive it as a prop from app called on remove. So we can just access it via this.props.onRemove. And we need to pass is removal to true. And we're already passing whatever value of is removal we get as a prop down to track. So we don't need to add an extra case. We just pass whatever value we get down to track. So that's good. And now in our track component, we're going to be creating a remove track. And we'll just be doing the same thing that we did up here. We'll just be doing on remove. And we'll need to make sure to bind it, obviously. Okay, we binded it. And we just need to pass it to the element that has the minus. So same thing we did with the add, we need to do with the minus. Just call remove. Okay. So let's just test this stuff out now. So let me refresh just to be safe. So if I click on the plus, it should add the track to the playlist. Good. And if I click it again, it shouldn't be able to add the same song. So hopefully this doesn't allow it. Okay, good. But I can add the other songs, but I can't add duplicates. And when I click on minus, it should remove it from the playlist. So, okay. Let's see what this issue is. So saying this.props to on remove is not a function. And this is in track. So let's check that out. Okay, so it's saying that we're not getting an on remove prop in track. So let's just make sure that we're passing on remove here. Oh, it looks like we're not. So let's just pass on remove to track. All right, so let's try it out now. Adding and click on it again to remove it. Okay, good. All right, everything looks to be good. And now we're going to be, looks like this assessment has to do with changing the name of the playlist. So over here, we're going to be able to change the name of the playlist before we save it to Spotify. All right, so in app.js, we're going to be creating a function called update playlist name. Let's just do that here. All right, so this method takes in a name as an argument, and it just updates the state of playlist name to be whatever we get as an argument. So remember, in our state, we just have a playlist name set to a string. So what this method does is it takes in a name, and it just updates our state to be that name. So we'll update playlist name to be whatever name we received as an argument. Okay, now we just need to bind it and then pass it to playlist as an attribute called onNameChange. So we pass it to playlist as onNameChange. Okay, cool. So 58 looks good. All right, so 59. So in the playlist component, we're going to be creating a method called handleNameChange. Let's do that. Okay, so because this method we're going to be passing to an event handler, one of like React's event handlers like onChange or onClick, it's going to be taking an event object as an argument. Okay, so this is going to be passed as an onChange handler to the input tag inside playlist. So this input tag, whenever it changes, we're going to be calling handleNameChange. And because we're passing as an event handler, we're going to need to bind it. So let's just do that in the constructor. So inside the method, we're going to be calling the onNameChange prop that we receive. So in app, we pass playlist and onNameChange. So we're going to have access to that via this.props.onNameChange. So we're just going to call that. And we need to pass this method the new name to set. And we can access that value via event.target.value. So we'll just do const new playlist name equals event.target.value. So event.target gives us the actual input element, and then .value will give us the value of whatever is currently inside this input element. So we'll just pass it the new playlist name. Okay, so let's just see if this works. We can do that by, let me just print a hi just to make sure it's running every time we change. Okay, so it is printing hi, but it's not actually changing the value of the input here. Let me see why that's happening. Oh, it's because we have a hard-coded value here. Did it not tell us to update this? Instead of having a hard-coded value, it should probably just set this as the default value, and then the value should just be updated automatically via onChange. Let me just see if they mentioned that default value. Oh, they did in step 21. Looks like I missed this. So we need to change value to default value. Okay, let's just try this out now. Let me scroll down back to where we were and try this out. Okay, cool. So it is updating this now, and it is running our function, so our state should be updating. Okay. So 59 should be good, as well as 60. We did 61 too. Okay, so these steps should be done. All right, so now this assessment, we're going to be creating the save playlist functionality. Okay, so now step 62. All right, so it looks like each track object is going to need to have a URI property. So we'll just add one to each playlist track. And later we're going to be using the actual API to use actual values. Okay, so in our app, let's just add a URI to each one of these. I'll just call these the same as the ID. So we're going to be passing. Okay, so now we need to create a method called save playlist inside app. Okay, so we're going to need to convert this array of tracks into, so this array of tracks, we're going to be converting it to an array of URIs. So instead of this array of objects, So each track object, we're just going to be extracting the URI from each track. And we're going to need to do this because when we actually call Spotify's API, we're going to need an array of track URIs to pass so that it knows which tracks to use, because it doesn't care about the names of tracks or anything. The actual Spotify API just wants like an array of URIs to save to the playlist. So let's do that now. So the save playlist method. Now remember, to convert one type of array to another, we can use the map method. So we're going to loop over, let's just do playlist tracks. So we're going to be calling map on this. Just map over this, and then so for the current track, we just want to convert it to just its URI property. So this will make us end up with an array of just track URIs. And I don't think we need to do anything with this right now. We're going to be using it later when we actually use the Spotify API. So we're good on that step. Okay, so 64, we need to bind save playlist. So let's just do that. And we need to pass it to playlist and make it called onSave. I call this save playlist. So now we're going to be adding a click listener to this button. And when we click on it, we should be running that onSave method that we receive as a prop in playlist. So let's go to playlist. And so we'll add an onClick here. And we'll just pass it this.props.onSave. So whenever we run this, whenever we click on this, it'll run that handler. And just to make sure that's working, let's just add a console.log to the onSave. And so when we click on the save playlist, it should run that. Okay, good. So we know that this function runs whenever we click save. So now we're going to be hooking up the search bar to Spotify. And it looks like we won't be using the API right now, but we're going to be setting up to use this. So let's go on to step 67. So in app.js, we're going to be creating a search method. And this is what's actually going to be calling Spotify.search later on. Let's create search. So it accepts a search term as an argument, and then it just prints out that term to the console. And later on, it'll be using that term to actually search Spotify. But I guess right now it just wants us to print it. So it takes in a term and just prints out that term. So because we're going to be passing it to this search button click handler, we're going to need to bind it. So let's do that in here. And then we need to pass it to the search bar component as an onSearch prop. So on search, we're going to run this search method. Okay, so in step 69, Let's go to search bar. And create a method called search, I think. Yep. And all this method does is call this.props.onSearch because we're passing an onSearch prop from app to search bar. So we're just calling that method, and we'll pass it the state of the current term. So now we need to see, so apparently we should have some state for the term. Let me just look and see if that was described anywhere. Wonder if this is an issue with the instructions. Yeah, it might be. So looks like search bar should have some state. So just do that here. So it should have a term. Let's just start that off to initial string. And so it should be passing this .state.term to the onSearch. And I imagine this state is going to change whenever the value in here changes. So we're probably going to be having an onChange handler to this input. I'm not sure if I actually missed it somewhere, or it might just not be described here. All right, so that looks good. Okay, so in step 70, we're going to be binding that search method that we just created in search bar. And yeah, it looks like they're mentioning to create constructor here, so they didn't mention one to create one before, so they might have just missed this part of the instructions. So let's just bind this.search. So in search bar, we need to create a method called handle term change. So yeah, this is when we change whatever values in here, we need to call handle term change, so which will update the state of the current term. And again, don't pay attention to the order of my methods. I kind of just put them anywhere. The only conventions I follow are I put all the render stuff on the bottom and the constructor at the top. So it takes an event object as an argument because we're going to be passing it to the onChange of this input. So we'll just get the new term from that event, same thing. We'll get it via event.target.value, and we'll just update our state to be that new term. We'll set term to new term. Okay, cool. So that's step 1. And we just need to bind it. All right, so now we need to hook it up to our input tag. So we'll add an onChange handler to this input. And so whenever it changes, we need to call handle term change. I'm just going to format my code with prettier. Okay, so now it looks like we're going to be setting up to actually use the Spotify API. Okay, so this is kind of a Codecademy convention where all the API stuff they like to put in a folder called util, separate from your components. And in util, you put in the file of whatever API you're using. In Ravenous, we use yelp.js. In this case, we're going to be doing spotify.js. So let's create that in source. So we'll create a new folder called util. And inside here, we're going to be creating spotify.js. Let me close all this other stuff out. Okay, so we created that. All right, so we're going to be creating a Spotify module. Okay, so this is just giving me a description of what we're going to do. So let's just skip that step. All right, so we did 75. All right, so in this file, we need to create a Spotify module as an empty object. So let's do that. And we need to export it. So let's just export Spotify. So above the empty object, we're going to be creating an empty variable that will hold the user's access token. Okay. Just do let user access token. I'll just set it to an empty string right now. So we're going to be creating a method called getAccessToken. So we're going to check if the access token is already set. If so, we just return that value. Okay, so we'll just check if this variable has a value. So an empty string counts as not a value. So if we do like if user access token, right now this would return false. So we'll just return the user access token if it exists. Otherwise, we're going to be doing some other stuff down here. Okay, so if the access token is not already set, we're going to be checking the URL to get the access token. So the way Spotify is going to work is when we first try to do any API request using search, it'll first make us try to authorize with Spotify. And once we've authenticated and it's taken us back to this page, the access token will actually be in the current URL. So first we need to see how to check the current URL. Obviously this isn't stuff you like need to memorize. You just should be able to look it up. So we just Google how to check current URL JavaScript and just look for a Stack Overflow. Usually they have the best answers. All right, so we can just do window.location.href to get the current URL. So if I do it right now in the console, it should get me this URL right here. Yep, looks like it does. Okay, so let's check out this guide they give us to see how we need to get the access token from the URL. Okay, so let's just search for the implicit grant flow. Okay, so we're going to be doing a fetch request to a URL that looks like this, and we're going to be passing it some stuff. And so once we come back from authenticating, the URL will be changed to look something like this, and we'll have access to an access token and when it expires and such. So we need to extract the access token and the expiration, I believe, from this URL. I think most commonly people use regular expressions to do this, and a regular expression is just a way to, you pass it a pattern, and it can be pretty complex or simple. Depends on what kind of pattern you're looking for, and then it'll check a string to find stuff that matches that pattern. And to save you guys some time, I'm not going to be trying to create the regular expression myself. Hopefully they give us here. Okay, yeah, so they give us the regular expressions to use. In this case, it's not too hard. So we'll be looking for the access token and the expires in. A regular expression starts with the slash and ends with the slash, so everything in between is the actual pattern we're passing in. So we're looking for an access token equals, and then whatever is inside that is going to be evaluated as the variable. Sorry if that didn't make sense, but basically we just be passing this pattern in to extract the access token and the expiration value from the URL. Okay, so let's try to do this. So the current URL is window.location.href. And so to get pass in a regular expression to look for, we can use the match method on a string. So we can do url.match. And so let's just get the access token first. So access, we'll just set we already have a variable for it here. So let's just do user access token equals url.match, and then we pass it the regular expression we want to use. In this case, we just use this one. And so let's create a new variable for the expiration date equals url.match, and that's this one. Okay, so that should be good. So if the access token and expiration time are in the URL, so let's just make sure both are in. So if either one of these are null or undefined, this expression will return false, so this won't run. Okay, so let's actually just test this stuff out. So let me get an example URL we can use. So let me just open up the console and test this stuff out. So we'll just set example URL variable to this string. I think this ... just means more characters. I'll just put in whatever. Okay, so our URL variable is that string. And let's just try doing a match on it. So we can do, so if we do this expression, it should get us the access token. Oh, okay, so it looks like url.match returns an array with a bunch of stuff, not just the matches. So the first argument in the array looks like the match as well as like the thing that we're matching for. But all we want is actually just what the actual match is. So we just want the second value in the array. So looks like we just want to set user access token to the second value in that array. So the second value, because arrays are 0 indexed, the second value would be 1. And let's just try the other regular expression to make sure it works. Okay, yep, so we want the second value, which is the same thing, so let me just check the instructions again. So we need to set a variable for the expiration time. And it looks like this will just return it as a string, so we need to convert this to a number. Also, what format is this in? Let me look for expires in. Okay, so it's in seconds. All right. So we'll get the expiration time by converting the expires in at 1. Expires in at 1. So that gets us the actual match. And we need to convert this to a number. And the easiest way to do that is just run the number function on whatever string you want to pass. So this will convert 3600 to an actual number in seconds. So it'll be 3600 seconds. And we need to reset our access token. We need to expire it at that time. So basically after this amount of time has passed, we need to set our user access token back to an empty string. And so to do something after a certain amount of time, the normal way to do it is using the set timeout function. So the way set timeout works is you pass it a function that you want to run, and you pass it when you want it to run. So like if we do something like this, basically set timeout will wait 300 milliseconds and then it'll run whatever you put inside this function. So this format is in milliseconds and this expires in is actually in seconds, as I showed you before. So we need to convert seconds to milliseconds. And to do that, we can just multiply whatever this is by 1000. And so once this expiration time is passed, we just want to reset our user access token. Okay. And then we need to clear the parameters from the URL. So we need to remove the current access token from the URL so that it's not used after it's expired. Okay, so I don't actually remember how to do that off the top of my head, so let me look that up. So update page URL with JavaScript. Let's just open up a few links. Okay, this actually looks like what we want to do. So history.pushState. So let me look up how the exact syntax is used. Playing the browser history, push state. Okay. Just look up the exact syntax. Okay, so we pass it three things. The state object. Okay, so we can just pass in anything for this. This is just in case we wanted to go back to this state for like later in the application and then extract the value that we saved at that time, but we don't really need to do that, so it's not something we need to worry about. A title, okay, which is currently ignored, so I don't know why we would want to pass that because it's not used. And then a URL. So this last thing that we passed, push state, is what actually our URL gets set to. So we'd probably just want to pass it slash so that for example, if the URL is currently like this, if we pass it slash, it'll just remove everything else and just keep the slash, so it goes back to the original page. Okay, so let's try this out. So we want to window.history. If you don't put window dot, it just assumes that we're using window because window is like the top level global object. So if we just do history.pushState, it'll just use window.history.pushState. Same thing for set timeout. It doesn't matter if you do this instead. Some people like to explicitly do this, so I'll just do it just because it's good practice. So push state. So the first thing you pass in is a state object. You can just pass in whatever. So for the access token. And then second argument, it's not even used by browsers. I guess it might be used later, which is why they just put that in just in case, but we'll just pass in null because it doesn't matter what we put in. And third object, we want to put in slash, so we go back to like the root page. This is the only one that's like actually important. Okay, so that should reset the URL back to this. Close this stuff out. Okay, let's just check the hint. Yeah, looks like everything looks good. They're multiplying by 1000, so believe we're doing that. Yep. Okay. So step 80 looks good. Okay, so 81. Okay, so the third condition is that the access token variable is empty and is not in the URL. So now we need to check if the access token doesn't exist in the URL. So we need to register at Spotify before we do this. I already did set up everything. I didn't set like redirect URIs or anything, but I have created an application. Okay, so let's add this redirect URI right now. So at the top of Spotify, we need to create a client ID and a redirect URI variable. So let's do that. Oh, sorry, that's the redirect URI. client ID should be, oh, that's a secret. Let's just copy the client ID. Okay, so at the top of Spotify, we're going to be creating some constant variables, which we did. All right, so that should be good. So now let's create the conditional statement for when there's no access token. So else. So we're going to redirect them to this URI. Let's just look up how to do that. And obviously I could just like be looking at hints, but I think it's good practice to like look up how to do small tasks like this, because this is something you'll have to do often. And it's good to like get used to like how to search and stuff. So how to redirect to URL JavaScript. No one expects you to like memorize every single method and function. You should just be able to like look it up when you need to use it. So window.location.replace, or we can just set it equal to a page. I think this is just easier to understand. So I'll just use that, and we'll navigate to, what URL was it? Let's copy this URL. Just format my code with prettier. Okay, that didn't really help, I guess. I guess you can't really do anything about that length. Okay, so instead of using these client ID and redirect URI things, we need to replace those with actual values. So this should be a template string instead, so that we can interpolate JavaScript. So the client ID goes here, and redirect URI goes there. Okay, we just, okay, good. Okay, so for the next assessment, looks like we're going to be implementing the search request that we send to Spotify. Okay, so we'll need our user access token, obviously, and looks like this is the endpoint we're going to be using. And we can look at this documentation to see what we need to do. Okay, so when we do our search, we're going to be passing a type of track. Yep, that's what it mentions here. All right, and we can look at what the response will look like. There's no response example for tracks, it seems. Oh well. So let's just get started. Okay, so let's just get the initial URL. Okay, in Spotify, we're going to be creating a search method that takes in a term. And because this is an object, we need commas after each property. So after the get access token method, we need a comma, and then we'll do search. Takes in a term as input. Let's create endpoint variable that's set to so when we search by track, okay, cool. Track equals, oh sorry, type equals track. All right. So search is going to return a promise that will eventually resolve to the list of tracks from the search. So we're going to be returning a chain of promises similar to what we did with Ravenous. All right, so this is going to be a GET request. So if you don't pass in the type of request to fetch as options, it'll just assume GET by default. So we can just fetch this endpoint. And then we can call .then on the response. So now with the response, we'll want to convert it to JSON. Oh, sorry, we can't just search by track. We need to pass in the term to look for with the track, because we're passing in a term here like hello. So when we do that, it should use this term to search for the track. So we need to pass in the query as well. So, and Q equals term, and we need to use template literal quotes. And so we'll also need to pass in some headers. We can't just fetch like this. So before I get ahead of myself, let me just finish this fetch. So additional options you pass to fetch, you just pass in a second argument as an object. And here you can pass in other stuff like the type. If you weren't doing a GET request, you would do like, I think it's method. So you would do like post or something. In this case, we can just do GET. So we don't need to do that, but we do need to pass in some headers as an object. So we can just pass it here. So one header that we need to add is an authorization. And whenever you pass in an authorization header, you need to do bearer. And then you pass in the client stuff or the access token here. In this case, we're going to be doing access token, so we can just use the user access token here. So this will authorize us to the Spotify API so that they know that we're like an authorized application that is allowed to use Spotify because we registered through their site. If we didn't do so, we wouldn't have access to this access token and we wouldn't be able to do this API call. Okay, so we did that. And now we're going to turn the response to JSON. And the usual way to do that is do a .then. So I'm going to call the fetch. Once the fetch is done, this then will run. And with the response, we'll just want to convert it to JSON. We can do so via response.json. And then we'll do another .then to do something with the JSON once it's done converting. So let me just format my code with prettier. Okay, so now with this JSON response, we're going to map the converted JSON to an array of tracks. If the JSON does not contain any tracks, return an empty array. So let me just look at an example of the response we'll get. Okay, so this is what it should look like. It has a bunch of properties that We won't be using a lot of these properties. We'll just be using the ones we want. All right, so we'll check if it has a tracks property on it. Otherwise, we'll just return an empty array. So if it doesn't have .tracks, we'll just return an empty array. Otherwise, we'll be mapping over and just getting the fields that we want. So return JSON response.tracks.map. So for the current track, we'll return a different object. Return so it should have an ID. We'll just use current track.id. And let me open this on the left side so we can just keep referencing it. Okay, so we need ID and a name. So that should be, okay, that'll just be name. I'm just doing this just to make sure that it's not named something different in the actual Spotify API response. Okay, so artist. Oh, it looks like they're actually giving you what the Spotify API returns, so we can just use these. I just called it current track instead of track, so I'll just have to replace all that. Track with current track. And URI. Okay, that should be good. So now we're going to be testing this out. Let's see. I imagine this is not going to fail completely the first time, but we'll be able to debug it if it does. All right, so in app.js, we'll import the Spotify. So we'll get out of the app folder, get out of the components folder, go into util, and select Spotify. And now we're going to update the search method inside app. Instead of console.login.term, we'll be calling Spotify.search with that term. And remember that we're returning this fetch. So, oh, we're not actually, but we should be. So return fetch. And so we're returning whatever the last then returns. So this is this mapped array is what's going to be the final output of Spotify.search. So this is a promise that will resolve to that. So we can call it .then on this to that array of tracks. So we can just call this tracks. So tracks is going to be whatever is returned with this map call over here, which is an array of tracks. And we're going to update search results to whatever Spotify.search returns. So we'll call this.setState search results to those tracks. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to actually test out the search just to see if it actually does work. So let me do that by putting a console.log in the search. And we'll just print out the tracks just to see if we actually do get like a response from the API call. All right, so let's try this out. I'm sure this is going to fail, but let's just see. Hello. Okay, it looks like it's not even running at all. So let me go to the search bar component. Oh, we don't even have an on-click listener to the search button. I don't know if I accidentally skipped that. or if it just wasn't mentioned in the steps, but let's just add an on click to the search, and it should call this.search. All right, so let's try that again. Hello. Okay, so we're getting a 400 error. And if I go to the network tab, we can get some more information about the error we just got. So if I go into this error right here, and it looks like only valid bearer authentication supported. So it looks like we're not passing in a valid bearer authentication, so we're not passing in headers. And that basically means that we're not passing in a correct user access token, which makes sense because when we click search, it should first authorize us with Spotify. So it looks like we should be doing that in search actually. So let me see why we're not being taken to the authorization page when I call get access token. Oh, it looks like search doesn't actually ever call it. So instead of using this user access token directly that we define up here, we should be calling get access token. And the way get access token is going to work is if the token exists, it'll just return it. Otherwise, it'll redirect us to this page. Oh, and if the page does have the access token and the expiration date, it should be returning it. So I should make sure to add a return statement here. Okay, cool. So let me get the access token from calling that method. And just use this variable instead. Okay, so let me open that back up. Okay, good. So it does take us to this page. And let me just skip. Okay, so now we've authenticated. Let's just see if it works now. Now if we search for hello. Okay, so we are getting a JSON response, but tracks does not seem to be an array. So let me print out what tracks is to see what it actually looks like. I'll do that in search. So let me just print out the JSON response just so I know what I'm working with. Okay, so it's an object actually, it's not an array. And the array is under the items property of that object. So we can just do tracks.items.map. Okay. Now if I run the query again, I have to do it twice because the first time it's gonna authenticate you. So, all right, looks like the search worked. Awesome. Sorry about that one. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so now we're going to be creating the save playlist functionality. So under search, I'm going to create a method called save playlist. Just remember to have a comma after each method. So it's going to take in a playlist name and an array of track URIs, so it knows which tracks to save to the playlist. So it's going to be making 3 separate fetch requests to Spotify API, it looks like. So we're going to get the user's ID with a GET request. And a post is usually used like to create something. So we're going to be creating a new playlist with the playlist name that we get as an argument to the account of that user. And as a response, we'll get back the playlist ID that was created. And then we're going to be posting the track URIs to this playlist. So once we create the playlist, we need to create the tracks to put into the playlist. So we're going to be doing that as the last request. And we're going to be updating it in app. So let's just get started with doing it in Spotify. So first thing we need to do is get the current user's ID. And then with this user ID, we're going to do another fetch. And in this one, we're going to be creating a new playlist to that user ID. So now we need to see how to create a new playlist. Create a playlist. Okay, so we just do this URL. And then we pass in the user ID / playlist. Okay, cool. So let me copy this first. Okay, so we fetch this URL. And if we're creating a playlist, we need to do this. And it should be template literals, so we can evaluate that. And I called the variable user ID. And just to refresh, whatever you return in a then, that's what gets accepted as a parameter the next then. So we're returning response.json here. So whatever this returns, that's going to be show up in this parameter. You can call this whatever you want, but whatever you return in the previous then is what shows up in the parameters the next then. So in this then, I return JSON response.id, so it gets accepted as a user ID. It doesn't really matter how many thens you use. We could be doing this fetch here, so we could just make this one function, and so once we get JSON response ID, we can just do fetch on that over here, but I like just making each one small just so it's easy to understand the flow of what's happening. Okay, so we get the user ID. All right, so we're going to be posting to that. And because it's a post, we need to pass an additional argument. So first, let's just set the headers, copy this. And then we also need to make the method post because it thinks it's a get by default if you don't pass in a method. Okay. And so from the response of that, we're going to be getting a playlist ID. Let's just look at the response just to be safe. All right, response format, we get a playlist object in JSON format. So we're going to need to call JSON response.json again on this response to get this playlist, and just use the playlist ID so that we can add songs to it. So from calling this, we're going to get a response. We'll convert that response to JSON. And with that JSON response, so JSON response will be this playlist object, and we just need the ID from it. So we'll just return JSON response.id. And then, so this ID is the playlist ID. So yeah, you'll see that you'll get a bunch of thens. I think Codecademy just recommends using, well, they don't recommend it, but I think the way I've seen most people do it, following the hints, they only have like a few thens. But I like having multiple thens that are very short and concise, that are easy to follow, rather than having very long thens. That makes it hard to understand what's going on. So with this JSON response, we're returning the ID. So we get the playlist ID here, because whatever you return in one then, you get in the next one. So the playlist ID, what do we want to do? Okay, so we're going to be posting the track URIs to the newly created playlist, and we're going to be needing to use the user ID as well as the playlist ID. So let's look at the API. Okay, so adding tracks to a playlist. Remove tracks from the playlist. Replace reorder. Oh, add tracks to a playlist right here. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing. Let me copy the base URL. So we're going to be calling another fetch with this URL right here. Same thing, use template literals. Oh. Okay, so I think I see why Codecademy recommended that we do it in a few thens, because inside this then, we won't have access to the variables from the previous then. So we need the user ID over here, but we won't have access to it here. So we need to do all of these calls inside this then. So it's kind of unfortunate, but it looks like we'll have to do it that way. Okay, so let me fix this. So with the user ID, we'll just do this function right here. So move this fetch over here. Okay, so this fetch will, oh sorry, so it takes in a bunch of stuff. Okay, so we call fetch to create the playlist, and once we do that, we have the playlist ID. Okay, cool. Please bear with me while I reorganize this just to make it work. So we're going to have to do we're just basically going to have to nest a fetch inside this then, because we need the user ID within all of this stuff. So we need to keep all this stuff inside the function that has access to this scope right here. So these calls need to be moved inside this last then. So we call then on that. So we don't get the playlist ID, we get a response that we convert to JSON. So let me move this. Almost done, I promise. So, and with the JSON response, we get the playlist ID. So we'll just set it to a variable. Okay, so let me just format this prettier. All right, now we can use user ID and playlist ID here, because all of this stuff is inside this function right here. So this function right here, and we have access to this user ID as well as this playlist ID inside here. So there won't be any issues with that anymore. Okay, so we call fetch to create tracks. So we need to pass in, let me just move the variable to the URL to a variable just because it's getting very long. Add songs URL. So we need to pass it the headers. As well as making the method post. Okay, so let's just go through the flow one time. So we get the user ID by calling this /me. And then with that, we get the JSON response from that to get the user ID here. We return the user ID. So we have access to user ID here. And then we create a playlist using that user ID. And then from calling this call, we get another JSON response. And from that JSON response, we just extract a playlist ID. So now we have access to this user ID and playlist ID inside this then. And we use that to add a bunch of songs to that playlist using the user ID and playlist ID. Hopefully this makes sense. I know I was kind of messed up, but hopefully it's okay now. Oh, actually I take that back. I think after we save the playlists, we will want to reset playlist name back to some default value, and then we'll also want to remove all the current stuff that's inside playlist tracks. So we'll probably want to reset playlist tracks as well as the playlist name. So .then we'll just call this .setState. So we'll set playlist name back to my playlist. So you can just set this back to some default value. And we'll just, the main thing that we need to do is update playlist tracks to be an empty array. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Now let's go back. Create a method in Spotify.js that accepts two arguments. The first argument is the name of the playlist. The second is a track of URIs. Okay, that's kind of weird, but I think it's just talking about our save playlist method in Spotify. So I think before we do this, we just need to make sure that the playlist name and track URIs exist. If not, we just don't do anything. And sorry about the instructions again, guys. I imagine this is because it's like one of the newer courses, so it still needs some time updating. So if there isn't a playlist name, or if there isn't some track URIs, we just return. We don't do anything. Otherwise, it'll run all the stuff below. Okay. So I actually just realized what's happening. So step 89, it's kind of just like a description of what we need to do. And then the later steps gives you like step by step on how to do it. So we've actually done all of these steps. Yep. So we use the user ID to create a playlist. We did that. And then we updated app.js to call that. And after that, it looks like we're done. So the rest is just deploying it if you want to like deploy it to a separate website, but I'm probably not going to be doing that in this tutorial. But it's pretty easy. You can just follow these 3 steps to do it. So let's actually test this out now and see if it works. So let me open up the console, refresh. Okay, so if we run hello, it'll authenticate us. Now if we do hello again, let me actually remove these default songs from the playlist first, actually. Just so we don't have data that'll mess it up, because these aren't valid tracks. Same thing for the search results. We don't need these anymore. Okay. Alright, so now let's try saving it to a playlist. Just call it my example playlist. Okay, so it looks like there's some issues with our /playlist route. So let's just see what happened there. So when you pass it the user ID /playlist, we're passing in headers. Oh, we need to pass it a body, because right now we're telling the API to create a playlist, but it doesn't know what we want to call the playlist. So we have to pass in a body. And this body should just be an object that has a, I believe, a name property. So let me actually let's look in the API. So create a playlist. So body parameters. So yeah, we give it a name, and that's required, which is why this is failing. And okay. So yeah, so let's just pass it a name, and the name we want to call it is whatever they gave us as a playlist name. So we'll just pass it here. And whenever you pass in object bodies, just make sure to stringify it. That's just something you have to do with fetch. So you basically need to pass the body in as a string. And if you're passing in an object, you just need to stringify it. So this will convert an object to a string. And to extract a stringified JSON back to an object, you can do json.parse, which looks like this. So you can just pass it some stringified object and it'll convert it back to an object. So fetch will handle that. You just need to stringify it before you send it. Okay, and we'll probably need to do that here as well. So, okay, so let's try this out now. Oh, syntax error. Should not be a semicolon, it should be a comma. All right, so let's run a query for search. Add some songs. Test playlist. Now if we click save. All right, so I reset the state, but let's make sure that it actually added it to our Spotify playlist. I actually don't use Spotify, so I'll have to see how to do this. Account. My Spotify playlist. How do you find your playlists? Oh, is it the web player? Okay, should be here. Yep, looks like we created test playlist. And it has the hello songs we added. Awesome, so it looked like it worked. Alright, so looks like the app is working. Hopefully you guys were able to learn something from that. I'm really sorry on how long this took and for all the stumbling along the way. This was actually my first time doing it, so it was a good experience, I guess, to see the debugging process and work. Please ask me any questions you have. I'm sure you guys are going to have questions due to how kind of jangled it was, but hopefully you were able to take something out of it. All right, I'll see you guys in the next course.